Okay, so can everyone see my slides okay?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, good. Okay, so I will begin. I'm Jane Busby, and thank you so much for joining me for my talk on boundaries in divorce. Next slide, please. So, are you fed up with being disrespected and taken advantage of in your divorce? Well, I'm going to be sharing with you what you need to know about boundaries, how to set them and keep them firm, and you'll discover 5 key areas where you need boundaries. And before I go any further, I just want to say briefly that as a younger version of myself, I struggled to set boundaries and assert my needs. I divorced 9 years ago, and looking back in my marriage, I felt increasingly resentful because I failed to set boundaries, communicate my needs, and I didn't speak up for fear of having uncomfortable conversations. If I was angry, I would express it in a passive aggressive way, making sarcastic remarks and, to my shame, slamming doors. I'm not proud of what I did, but I know better now. And with the benefit of my experience as a divorce coach and mediator, I could see where I went wrong. And the principles and information I'm going to share today will help you avoid the boundary mistakes that I made and that so many others make too. So next slide, please. So in your divorce or separation, do you find yourself feeling resentful, angry, or taken advantage of? Do you struggle with what to say when your boundaries are crossed? And do you explode rather than make a calm, simple statement? And do you avoid speaking up to keep the peace and avoid confrontation? Well, if you're saying yes to any of these, you might need to look at your boundaries. So next slide, please. So the importance of boundaries, well, they're crucial for a healthy relationship with your ex. They're empowering. They create self-respect. They're essential for self-care, and they enable you to heal and move on with your life. And they raise self-esteem. Next slide, please. So setting boundaries define your roles post-breakup, and they communicate acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. They're parameters for knowing what to expect, and they create clarity. They're a way, as I said before, to create a healthy relationship with your ex, and they also enable healthy co-parenting for your children. And they're a way to feel safe. Next slide, please. And on that last point about safety, if you are dealing with someone who is abusive, controlling, or threatening your physical or emotional safety, then I strongly recommend that you seek advice from an organisation such as the Domestic Abuse Helpline, Men's Advice Line, and if it's urgent, call the police on 999. I also recommend that you consider specialist advice from a family law solicitor to help you make the legal arrangements that might be necessary to protect you. Next slide. So what exactly is a boundary? Well, boundaries are about communications, and boundaries are about creating healthy communications with your ex. Now, you may think that boundaries are all about your ex's behavior, but really it's about yours. Once you start setting boundaries, you change. You become assertive, you understand what you want, and your confidence and self-esteem increases. You get to be your authentic self, and you realize that what you need and think matters. You have more control over your life. And the next slide, please. So here's a definition of a boundary. It's a clear and concise communication of your expectations and needs. And clear is kind and unclear is unkind, to quote Brené Brown. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry, could you just go back to the previous slide? Sorry. And I would just say about it being a boundary being a clear, concise communication of your expectations and needs. Your ex doesn't automatically know what you need or expect unless you tell them. We can't read each other's minds. And too often we assume that the other should know, or that it's a given in this situation or that situation, but that's not always the case. It's your job to make it clear, to avoid ambiguity and to avoid misunderstandings. So next slide, please. So how do I know what my needs and expectations are, you might be thinking? Well, there are 2 steps to that. The first is to define your goals. And secondly, or the second step, is to know your core values. So next slide, please. So in defining your goals, it's a good idea to spend time thinking about your goals for a relationship with your ex. And questions you might ask yourself include those shown on the screen. In 5 or 10 years' time, how would I like to look back on how I communicated with my ex? How do I want my relationship with my ex to be? Amicable, respectful, reduced or no conflict? What will be the best way to communicate with my ex? Face-to-face, text, phone, email? And how do I want conversations about the children to be like? When do I want to communicate or have contact with my ex? Do I want to maintain a relationship with their family? And what subjects are off limits? When you know your goals, it's easier to set healthy boundaries right from the start, rather than trying to get the cat back in the bag further down the road. That doesn't mean to say that your boundaries can't change in the future, but protecting yourself during a vulnerable time should be your priority now. And the next slide, please. So the second part to knowing your needs and expectations is to know your core values. Now, a value is something that we hold to be important. And there's a dictionary definition there from the Oxford English Dictionary. A value is or are principles or standards of behaviour, one's judgment of what is important in life. And by identifying your values, it really does help with boundaries. And if you could just move on to the next slide, please. So when my clients come for coaching, I quite often show them a list of values, as I've shown on the screen. And I ask my clients to pick between 3 and no more than 5 of those values that resonate with them and that are important to them. Because by identifying your core values, you can recognize what you will and will not tolerate. The best boundaries are aligned with your values. So the next slide, please. So what can influence our awareness and understanding of boundaries? We might be overwhelmed by day-to-day living, such as caring for our children, working, dealing with the breakup, or swept up in emotional turmoil that we forget our oxygen masks. Also, how we learned or didn't learn about boundaries as a child can also influence our awareness of boundaries and the importance of boundaries. And also how we were socialized in society or cultural expectations. Now, women in particular, in terms of how they're socialized, are socialized as people pleasers. Now, I know I'm making a broad generalization there. Obviously, some men are people pleasers, but it tends to be women who are people pleasers. And as a people pleaser myself, we tend to put other people's needs before their own. We avoid conflict and difficult conversations. We take care of others and feel guilty when we take care of ourselves. We find it hard to say no, do things out of obligation, stay in unsatisfying relationships or situations, minimize our own feelings and needs, and compromise values to avoid confrontation. Next slide, please. So, when you're setting a boundary, there are 2 steps. And importantly, the first step is to communicate your boundaries. So communicate your boundaries clearly, firmly, and respectfully. Do not blame, criticize your ex, which can lead to defensiveness. And begin your sentences with I want, or I need, or I feel, rather than you always, or you never, or you did, because that leads to defensiveness. And choose the right time to set your boundary. If you can, stay calm and neutral, and be concise and specifically state what you need or want. And do not justify, get angry, or apologize for setting a boundary. And next slide, please. And remember, no is a complete sentence. Everyone has the right to refuse or to decline to do something. You do not owe any kind of explanation if questioned. However, if saying no is difficult for those of us who are people pleasers, then talking it through with a coach can really help. And that brings me on to the next slide, please. So you can try practicing these ways of saying no with a coach. I often role play with my clients so that they can use them the next time they might feel uncomfortable and need to set a boundary. And I also help my clients by rehearsing what they might say before they meet with their ex in a role play, which can really help them to feel confident when they're communicating their boundaries. So next slide, please. So when you're setting boundaries, you also need to communicate the consequences if your boundary is violated, and there probably will be violations, which I'll talk about later. But you need to ensure that you can follow through with the consequence if you want to maintain your boundaries and for your ex-partner to respect them. So, and they need to be clear. So for example, if you raise your voice, I'll end the call. Next slide, please. So tips for managing boundary violations. So remember, you are not responsible for your ex's reaction to your boundaries. And remind yourself you have the right to self-care. Remember your oxygen mask. And by the way, setting boundaries takes practice and determination if you're not used to setting boundaries. And expect resistance to start with. Next slide, please. So more tips on setting boundaries. Be consistent. If you set boundaries and then relinquish them, sometimes your ex may cross them whenever they like, knowing that you might not enforce them. You should calmly express their violation. Many people have their boundaries crossed and get passively upset about it or attack the boundary violator harshly. Either of these tactics leads to failure to hold on to boundaries. The way forward is calmness. So for example, even though you're upset, you've crossed the line and you've called me names again, so I'm leaving. So this way, your boundary setting becomes constructive rather than destructive. And also stay patient with yourself and also patient with your ex. It's entirely normal to blunder from time to time. You might forget your boundaries sometimes or slip up if your ex triggers you. Don't beat yourself up about that. If you have boundary issues, it's going to be difficult to get it right first time. And of course, your ex may also have boundary issues. Even with the best of intentions, they might find it hard to stick to rules. So next slide, please. So moving on to the key areas where you need boundaries: emotional, physical, co-parenting, communications, and internal. So next slide, please. So moving on to emotional boundaries. Well, disentangling yourself from your ex isn't easy, but emotionally distancing yourself from your ex may be the most important thing you can do for your well-being. And continued interest in their lives might seem natural at first, but will complicate your path to healing from the separation. So if you've got no boundaries in place, your ex might be invalidating your feelings. Your ex might tell you to move on and get over it. And perhaps either of you or one of you is inquiring about the other's personal life. Or perhaps you're following each other on social media, or you're having sex with your ex-partner. If you've got a boundary in place, excuse me, you can say, it's not okay for you to tell me how I should feel. I need time. I recommend you do not discuss your personal lives. Unfollow on social media and do not have sex with your ex. Next slide, please. So physical boundaries. If you don't have a physical boundary in place, perhaps your ex lets themselves into your home unannounced, or your room if you're still living in the same home. Or your ex goes through your post, your emails, your phone, or has your passwords. And when you're having discussions, your ex stands too close to you. But with a boundary in place, you might say to your ex, I need some notice from you, please, when you intend to return to the family home. Or please respect my right to privacy and change your passwords. And you can simply say to them, if they're standing too close, you're standing too close, please step away. And next slide, please. So another important area where you need to have boundaries is co-parenting. So if you're co-parents and you have no boundaries, you can't plan because you never know when your ex wants to be with the children. And perhaps you're doing all the school runs, the homework, you're taking them to their social events, their clubs and their sports events. But if you have a boundary in place, you might have a parenting plan. And a parenting plan creates a clear framework for your expectations and roles as co-parents. And it puts the children at the centre and not in the middle. And if you're having difficulty creating your own parenting plan, and there are many templates that you can use, but if you do have difficulty putting one together, with my mediator's hat on, I would say that a mediator can help you put together a parenting plan. And also many mediators are registered with the government's mediation voucher scheme, which pays up to £500 per case towards your mediation costs. It's non-means tested and you qualify automatically if you have children. So there's nothing to lose. So next slide, please. So communications, another area where you need boundaries. So if you have no boundaries, your ex might be phoning you at any time. Your ex might be verbally abusive. Your ex constantly blames or makes accusatory remarks. But if you have a boundary in place, you make clear your preferred method of communication and time of communication. You make clear that you'll end a conversation if accusatory remarks and blame continue. And next slide, please. And finally, I'm going to end on another important boundary area, and that is internal boundaries. So these are the boundaries that you have with yourself, and these are very important. So pause and remember your goals and values, and also remember these affirmations. I have the right to express my needs and expectations. I have the right to be treated with respect. I have the right to self-care. I have the right to say no. And I have the right to express my feelings. So now you know about the importance of boundaries in divorce, how to create and maintain them. They're essential for your well-being. They're essential so that you can have a healthy relationship with your ex. They create clarity and they enable you to heal and move on with your life. So thank you very much for listening. And that's that. So apologies for my error on not being able to share the screen earlier on. Are there any questions about boundaries?
Any questions from anybody? Thank you, Jane. It was very informative.
I just remembered there's something I forgot to mention actually about if you're having issues about communicating with a co-parent and you're finding that they're constantly overstepping your boundaries and you're not able to keep them, you could try a parenting app such as Our Family Wizard. That can be really helpful. I think it did come up on the on one of my slides, but it's something that I didn't go into in great detail.
I've got a question just pertaining to what to your webinar and presentation and mine. It was a very clear presentation. Thank you very much. Lots of skills, lots of tips, and so on. I can see how useful that would be for someone preparing to come into mediation, of course, to have a co-parenting conversation and so on. Do you work with and prepare people for specifically for mediation? Is that something you?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I'll often do pre-mediation coaching and coaching whilst they're in mediation because some clients really do need that extra support.
Great. Yeah. No, that's good. Thank you. No, excellent. I'm able to contact you, have a chat.
Jane or John, have you got a link for the mediation voucher?
I have an assistant who does that for me, so they've got it. So we get quite a few going through. So I haven't.
It's just that someone was asking in the chat.
It's an organisation called OPIA, OPIA Voucher Scheme. Bear with me a second.
I would just say that the mediator applies for the voucher on your behalf. So the process is that you would meet with the mediator first for your mediation information and assessment meeting, which is the MIAM. And if mediation goes ahead, the mediator will apply for the voucher on your behalf. You have to send the mediator a form of consent to the mediator submitting various data about you because the Ministry of Justice wants to monitor how their scheme is going. And usually the vouchers are allocated quite quickly. So it's a really good way to fund part of your mediation or all of it, depending on what the issues are.
I concur.
Thank you.
Just one question, Jane. Sometimes when you work with clients and you teach them about boundaries, they start implementing them and so on. And not only clients, but sometimes ourselves, after a while, we go back to our old pattern. And as because you've been talking about boundaries, I don't know whether you are able to share any tips for keeping up with those boundaries and not reverting to the old ways.
Well, I think it's just having that ability maybe to step back, as I said at the end, to step back, to pause, to have that awareness. And it can be difficult when we're in emotional turmoil. But it is just trying, if you can, just to pause, to step back, and perhaps to just be the observer of yourself. It's easier said than done. It does require a conscious effort to do that. Maybe not when you're feeling highly stressed, but maybe after you've tried some calming techniques, such as going for a walk or doing some mindful breathing or something like that. But yeah, it's just trying to step back, pause, and just observe your thoughts, observe observe what's going on, I would suggest. So, you know, I mean, that's part of the important part of what a coach is doing with our clients, is helping them step back, helping them become aware of perhaps of their unconscious thoughts, and bringing those to the forefront, so that we are making conscious decisions, and instead of reacting, we can respond thoughtfully and carefully to what's going on.
Thank you.
Anyone else, or shall I stop the recording and then people can just chat freely?